1960, Charles Bronson sat in a casting office waiting. He had been acting for almost a decade, appearing in over 40 films, and he was still nobody, still the heavy, still the thug, still the guy with no name in the background. The casting director looked at his resume and sighed. "Mr. Bronson, you are almost 40 years old. Do not you think you are a little old to be starting a career as a leading man?" Charles looked at the man and said something he would been told his entire life. "I am not starting. I have been doing this for 10 years. The casting director shrugged. "Well, maybe it is time to consider that is not going to happen." Charles stood up to leave. And then director John Sturges walked into the room and said 5 words that would change everything. "Wait, I want to see him." What happened in the next 30 minutes would prove that Hollywood's entire system for determining who becomes a star and who does not was fundamentally broken. This is the story of how Charles Bronson became a legend at an age when most actors are considered finished. To understand why The Magnificent Seven was Charles Bronson's last chance, you need to understand how brutal Hollywood was in 1960 to actors who did not fit the mold. The studio system still dominated. Studios decided who became stars. They manufactured images, created personas, built careers from scratch. If you were young, handsome, and fit the all-American ideal, the system could make you a star. If you were not, you could be the most talented actor in the world, and it would not matter. You would always be a supporting player, always replaceable. Charles Bronson was the opposite of what Hollywood wanted in 1960. He was approaching 40, which in Hollywood terms meant he was too old to be a new star. His face was weathered, scarred, distinctly ethnic. He looked like someone who had lived a hard life because he had. The coal mines had left their mark. World War II had left its mark. A decade of rejection had left its mark. When casting directors looked at Charles Bronson, they did not see leading man potential. They saw a character actor, someone to fill out the background, someone to play the villain, never the hero. By 1960, Charles had appeared in films with major stars, Gary Cooper, John Wayne, Vincent Price, but he was always the supporting player. He would learn to accept it. This was his ceiling. He would work steadily, make a decent living, and die unknown, except film buffs who noticed character actors. His marriage to Harriet was strained. They had 2 children and constant financial pressure. Harriet had sacrificed her own career to support Charles. And after 10 years, they were barely getting by. Charles felt like a failure. He had promised Harriet he would become a star, and instead, he was just another working actor struggling to pay bills. Then, The Magnificent Seven came along. It was a big-budget Western based on Akira Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, one of the greatest films ever made. The story was simple. 7 gunfighters are hired to protect a Mexican village from bandits. The American adaptation would feature an ensemble cast of 7 distinct characters, each with their own personality, backstory, and arc. The film would be directed by John Sturges, who had just made The Great Escape. This was a prestigious project, the kind that could make careers. The lead roles went to established stars. Yul Brynner, the biggest name, would play Chris Adams, the leader. Steve McQueen, young and charismatic, would play Vin Tanner. James Coburn, Eli Wallach, Robert Vaughn, all talented actors with growing reputations. But there was one role that was proving difficult to cast. Bernardo O'Reilly, a half-Irish, half-Mexican gunfighter who joins the mission partly for money, but mostly because he cannot stand seeing innocent people suffer. Charles Bronson auditioned for Bernardo. He read the sides, delivered the lines, did everything he was supposed to do, but the casting director was not impressed. Too old, too rough, too ethnic. The role needed someone with more charisma, someone who could hold the screen against Brynner and Quenifer. Charles thanked them for their time and started to leave. This was what always happened. He would audition, be told he was wrong for the part, and go home to wait for the next rejection, but John Sturges stopped him. Sturges had been watching from the back of the room, and something about Charles had caught his attention. It was not charisma in the traditional sense. Charles did not light up the room. He did not perform, but there was something authentic about him. When he read the lines, it did not feel like acting. It felt real. Sturges asked Charles to read a specific scene. The scene where Bernardo meets the Mexican village children, and they ask him who the bravest man he ever knew was. In the script, Bernardo tells them about his father, a simple farmer who worked himself to death, trying to feed his family. Charles read the scene, and something happened that nobody in that room expected. Charles's voice broke, not dramatically, not in an actorly way, just a slight catch in his throat, a momentary pause, as if the words had touched something real inside him, because they had. Charles was thinking about his own father, Valerius Buczynskis, who had died in the coal mines when Charles was 10 years old, a man who had worked brutal hours in dangerous conditions to feed 15 children, a man who never lived to see his son escape poverty. When Charles finished reading, the room was silent. Sturges looked at the casting director and said, "He is Bernardo." The casting director started to protest. "John, he is almost 40. He is not going to be a star. We need someone younger, someone with more potential." Sturges cut him off. "I do not care about potential. I care about authenticity. That scene we just saw, that was real. You cannot fake that. He's Bernardo, and that was that." Charles Bronson had the role. Filming The Magnificent Seven was unlike anything Charles had experienced before. For the first time in his career, he was not just background. He was one of 7 lead characters. He had significant screen time. He had important scenes. He mattered to the story. And slowly, carefully, Charles began to realize that he could do this. He could carry a scene. He could hold the screen against actors like Yul Brynner and Steve McQueen, not through charisma or traditional movie star magnetism, but through presence, through reality, through being completely, authentically himself. The chemistry among the 7 actors was immediate. Brynner was the professional, always prepared, always in control. McQueen was the rebel, constantly trying to steal scenes, doing everything he could to draw attention to himself. Coburn was the cool one, effortlessly charming, and Charles was the silent one, the one who did not need to steal scenes because when he spoke, people listened. When he moved, people noticed. There was a gravity to Charles Bronson that could not be manufactured or learned. It just was. The scene that would define Charles's performance, and arguably his career, was the one that had gotten him the role, the scene with the children. In the film, Calvera's bandits have been raiding a small Mexican village, stealing their food and resources. The villagers hire the 7 gunfighters to protect them. The villagers are mostly farmers, simple people who have never used violence in their lives. Their children are fascinated by the gunfighters, seeing them as heroes, as brave warriors. In the scene, 3 Mexican children approach Bernardo while he is working. They ask him questions. "Who is the bravest man you ever knew?" Bernardo stops working. He looks at the children, and then he tells them about his father. Not a gunfighter, not a soldier, just a farmer, a man who worked sun-up to sundown, breaking his back to feed his family, fighting poverty and hardship every day of his life. And Bernardo says, with absolute conviction, that his father was braver than any gunfighter because he fought a battle he could never win, and he did it without complaint, without glory, just because it needed to be done. When Charles delivered those lines, he was not acting. He was channeling every memory of his own father. Every morning his father descended into the coal mines, knowing he might not come back. Every evening he came home covered in soot, too exhausted to speak, but still grateful to be alive for one more day. Every sacrifice he made for his 15 children, knowing that most of them would end up in the mines too, but hoping maybe 1 or 2 would escape. Charles's father never escaped. He died at 42, used up, worn out, killed by the mines, as surely as if they would collapsed on him. That authenticity translated to the screen. When audiences watched that scene, they did not see Charles Bronson, the actor. They saw a man speaking a truth so deep and so personal that it transcended the film. They saw real grief, real respect, real understanding of what courage actually means, and they felt it. That scene became one of the most memorable moments in The Magnificent Seven, not because of action or drama, but because of emotional honesty. The Magnificent Seven was released in October 1. It was a massive success, both critically and commercially. The film made over $11 million, an enormous sum in 1960. Critics praised the ensemble cast, the direction, the cinematography, and they noticed Charles Bronson, not as much as Hugh Brynner or Steve McQueen, who got most of the attention, but they noticed. They said things like, Bronson brings a quiet intensity, and watch for Bronson's powerful scene with the children. Industry people noticed too. Suddenly, casting directors who had dismissed Charles for a decade were calling his agent. But here is the thing that nobody expected. The Magnificent Seven did not immediately make Charles Bronson a star. Even after the film's success, even after critics and audiences responded to his performance, Hollywood still did not know what to do with him. He was 40 years old. He was not traditionally handsome. He did not fit any existing category. So, while his career improved, he still could not get leading man roles in Hollywood. He was still the supporting player, still the character actor. The real impact of The Magnificent Seven would not be felt until years later. What the film did was prove that Charles Bronson could connect with audiences, that his authenticity, his presence, his reality had value. It established him as someone worth paying attention to, and it opened doors, even if those doors led to more supporting roles at first. Films like The Great Escape in 1963, The Dirty Dozen in 1967, Once Upon a Time in the West in 1968, each role building on the last, each performance adding to the legend. But more importantly, The Magnificent Seven taught Charles something about himself. It taught him that he did not need to be like other actors. He did not need to be charismatic or charming or traditionally heroic. He just needed to be real, to bring his life experience, his pain, his understanding of what it means to survive, to every role. That was his superpower. That was what made him different. There is a story that John Sturges told years later about filming The Magnificent Seven. He said that one day during production, he was watching Charles between takes. Charles was sitting alone, not talking to anyone, just staring at the Mexican landscape. Sturges approached him and asked if everything was okay. Charles said, "I keep thinking about my father. How he died in those mines. How he never saw anything like this, never traveled, never escaped. And now I am here, making a movie, getting paid to pretend to be a cowboy. It feels wrong somehow, like I am living a life he should have had. Sturges said he did not know how to respond to that. What do you say to a man carrying that much survivor's guilt? But he understood in that moment why Charles was so powerful on screen. Charles was not just playing characters. He was working through his own trauma, his own history, his own complicated relationship with success. Every role was therapy. Every performance was an attempt to make sense of his journey from the coal mines to Hollywood, and audiences felt that depth, that authenticity, even if they did not understand where it came from. The Magnificent Seven scene with the children became iconic, not just because of the words, but because of what it represented. It represented a challenge to Hollywood's definition of heroism. The studio system wanted heroes who were young, handsome, fearless, uncomplicated, but Bernardo O'Reilly was none of those things. He was middle-aged, weathered, complicated, carrying pain. And he was saying that real heroism is not about guns or glory. It is about showing up every day to do impossible work with no recognition, no reward, just because someone has to do it. That message resonated because it was true, and it was true because Charles Bronson had lived it. He would watched his father do that impossible work. He would done it himself in the coal mines. He would survive the war. He would endured a decade of rejection in Hollywood. He knew exactly what it meant to keep fighting when you could not win, to keep working when there was no glory, to keep going when every rational person would quit. That knowledge, that hard-earned wisdom, was in every frame of his performance. After the Magnificent Seven, Charles Bronson's career trajectory changed, but slowly. He worked consistently throughout the 1960s, always in supporting roles, always reliable, always bringing that same authenticity. But he would not become a true star until 1974, when Death Wish made him one of the highest-paid actors in the world at age 53. That 14-year gap between breakthrough and stardom would have destroyed most actors. But Charles had learned patience in the coal mines. He knew how to endure. He knew how to wait. Looking back, The Magnificent Seven is important, not just because it is a great film, though it is. It is important because it proved that Hollywood's system for creating stars was flawed. The system said Charles Bronson was too old, too ethnic, too rough. The system said he would never be a leading man. The system was designed to reject people like him. But John Sturges looked past the system and saw something real. He bet on authenticity over manufactured charisma, and that bet paid off, not immediately, but eventually. The lesson of The Magnificent Seven is not just about Charles Bronson. It is about everyone who is being told they are too old, too different, too late. It is about the people who do not fit the mold, who do not look like what success is supposed to look like, who keep working anyway because they do not know how to quit. Charles Bronson was 38 years old when he got his first significant role. By Hollywood standards, he should have been finished before he started, but he was not finished. He was just getting started. There is a moment near the end of The Magnificent Seven where the surviving gunfighters are leaving the village they saved. The villagers are celebrating, rebuilding, moving forward with their lives. But the gunfighters are outsiders. They did their job, but they do not belong there. They are just passing through. One of the villagers says to Chris Adams, Yul Brynner's character, "You are like the wind. You blow through our village. You change things, and then you are gone." That is how Charles Bronson probably felt about Hollywood for most of his career, like the wind, passing through, changing things slightly, but never settling down, never truly belonging. But the Magnificent Seven was the moment Hollywood finally noticed the wind had a name, that the guy in the background, the one who had been there all along, was actually someone worth paying attention to. It took 10 years of rejection, hundreds of auditions, and one director who saw beyond the surface, but it happened, and once it happened, there was no stopping it. Charles Bronson once said in an interview, late in his life, "The Magnificent Seven saved my career, not because it made me a star, it did not, but because it taught me that I did not need to be like everyone else. I could be myself, bring my own experience, my own pain, and that was enough. That was more than enough." That is the real legacy of the Magnificent Seven for Charles Bronson. Not fame, not money, but permission. Permission to be exactly who he was. And that permission, that validation, was worth more than any paycheck,